Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, happy, oh my goodness, Friday to you. We're going to have a good time today. The book I've chosen is one of 3 books about the moth, all these wonders. And these are all true stories about facing the unknown. Foreword by Neil Gaiman and edited by Catherine Burns. There is another one, and I think what I may be doing is go to that book as well so that we have a real cross-section. And there are a total of 3 Moth books collections, all of them different, right here at Story and Song. I find these to be masterful and intriguing, to put it mildly. I'm going to read you a bit of the introduction to this. I first started hearing about the moth in the late 1990s. Word came that a gentleman named George Dawes Green and his friends were fluttering about New York City, telling stories on stage in front of packed crowds. It was described to me as a movable feast, a floating nightclub of sorts, devoted to first-person storytelling. The shows took place in bars and restaurants, museums, parks, speakeasies. It was a completely different group of storytellers each time, with legends like George Plimpton, Myra Nair, Vernon Reid, Andre Gregory, and Candace Bushnell sharing the stage with firefighters and accountants, dog walkers, and trapeze artists. George always had a keen ear for fabulous raconteurs and the charm to get them to be up on the stage. He surrounded himself with friends and collaborators who knew how to make things happen. Soon, a community of talented curators, producers, and directors sprang up. You know, it's hard to overstate how low-tech it all was. If you were lucky enough to manage to get on their mailing list, you'd receive a gorgeously designed, but inexpensively produced, postcard in the mail, often just days before the event. There were no advance sales, so you had to show up early, stand in a massive line, and claw your way in. It was always worth it. This was your only chance to hear the stories. There was no podcast to download afterward. Now, the first Moth I attended in person took place on the deck of an old boat parked on the Hudson River. I was mesmerized. What a thrill to hear a story directly from the person who lived it. The tellers were so vulnerable and funny and brave. They spoke without notes in front of a microphone on a stand, simply lit by a spotlight. I had never seen anything like it. It was the complete opposite of the film world that I'd been a part of for a decade, where even on an indie film, the stories would unfold on sets surrounded by dozens of crew. Maybe I wasn't the only one who was worn out by stories that could only be told with the help of thousands. George and his merry band of friends and collaborators were pushing for just the opposite, and in doing so brought on what can only be described as a modern storytelling movement, where dinner party stories were moved to the stage and recognized as art. This renaissance has inspired tens of thousands of shows worldwide in places as diverse as Tajikistan, Antarctica, and Birmingham, Alabama. We go to print on the cusp of our 20th anniversary. The stories in this book were all originally told live at Moth events around the world, then transcribed and lightly edited for the page. Each story was crafted with the help of one of the Moth's directors, many of whom have been with the Moth since nearly day one, starting out as volunteer story coaches and curators when there was no budget to pay them. The title of this book, All These Wonders, comes from Kathy Olkin's story in the last section. Now, out of context, I'm going to read that story to you. Now, back to the introduction, which puts us in the room at the moment she and her fellow NASA scientists first gazed at the surface of Pluto. A huge payoff that had, as is often the case, come only with great risk. And while most of us aren't rocket scientists, we all have moments in life when we are forced off the map. Sometimes it's by choice, metaphorically stepping into uncharted waters. Here be dragons, as the 16th century globes claimed. Other times, we get shoved there against our will by another person or by the fates. But the stories in this book show us that when we dare to face the unknown, we usually discover that we have more grit and tenacity than we thought. And we often land in a place that we couldn't even have imagined when we started out. The number one quality of all great storytellers is their willingness to be vulnerable, to tell on themselves in front of thousands. Each story is told as a gift to the listeners. But the audience brings a gift of their own. We live in a world where bearing witness to a stranger's unfiltered story is an act of tremendous compassion. To listen with an open heart and an open mind, and try to understand what it's like to be them. Why they think like that, dress like that, made the choices they did. It takes real courage. Some of the stories are lighthearted and fun, but others are more challenging. A boy soldier trying to recover what's left of his childhood. A humanitarian worker deciding who will live and who will die in a refugee camp. The Holocaust seen through the eyes of a 9-year-old. But we look away at our own peril. For what wonders await us when we don't turn away? Sometimes it is easier to try to make sense of the world, one story at a time. And when we dare to listen, we remember that there is no other. There is only us. And what we have in common will always be greater than what separates us. That, by Catherine Burns, the artistic director. And the first story I'm going to read to you after I take a sip of coffee made fresh. Oh, I wish you could smell that right from the cafe at Story and Song. So if you need a pick-me-up or a book or conversation, well, you'll find it all here, waiting for you. Title: As If I Was Not There, by Peter Prinkle. It was the week before Christmas, and I was sitting in the death cell in Portelaise Prison in County Laos, Ireland. Some weeks previously, I had been wrongly convicted and sentenced to death by the Special Criminal Court for a murder I did not commit. The Special Criminal Court is a non-jury court. I sat in that death cell, which was a very dismal place. The windows had been blocked off. There was no natural light, and a bank of fluorescent lights overhead which were never turned off day or night, and which after a little while began to burn my eyes. I was forced to be always in the presence of at least 2 jailers, and they would sit quite close to me. One day, I heard them having a conversation. They were discussing what role they might have to play in my hanging. One said to the other, "Shamus, were you told also that 2 of us would have to participate in the execution?" Oh, this was said as if I didn't exist, as if I wasn't a human being. And Shamus said, "Yes, that's right. What do you think we're going to have to do?" The third guy, Eddie, said, "Well, whatever we have to do, they're going to have to pay us extra money because this is not our usual job. So we're going to have to get a bonus for doing this work." They went on to discuss what role they might have to play, and they came to the conclusion that at my execution, 2 jailers would be positioned underneath the gallows. When my body came down through the trap door, each jailer would have to pull on one of my legs to ensure that my neck was broken quickly. It was as if I was not there. It was as if they weren't speaking about me. And I was very angry and upset and disturbed by this, but it illustrates the inhumanity of the death penalty. It even affects the jailers. Oh, they're not allowed to speak to the condemned prisoner because it wouldn't do them any good to learn to like the prisoner or to respect the prisoner. Because how can you cold-bloodedly help to kill somebody that you like or respect? Now, this was in the year 1980, and it was 26 years since this state had executed anybody. And there was a body of opinion which said that it was unlikely they would carry it out. But when I heard these jailers discussing my execution and the fact that the authorities had told them there would be a role for them in it, there was no doubt in my mind that I was facing death. I tried as best as I could to distance myself from that and to curb my anger. Christmas passed in a lonely, dismal way without any contact with the outside world and without any contact with my loved ones. Shortly after Christmas, as the post was being delivered to the prisoners, a jailer came, handed me a postcard, and this postcard was extraordinary. It was written by a woman I did not know, and she told in the postcard how the day after Christmas she was walking on the shore at Greystones, south of Dublin, grieving for her brother, whose name was Peter. He had been a seaman and had lost his life in an accident at sea. And she remembered that there was another Peter who was facing death. You see, I had been a fisherman, and I had spent a long time at sea. She remembered that there was another seaman named Peter, and she thought she would write to me to wish me well and to pray that I would not be executed. Oh, when I got that card, well, it just lifted my heart. That lady, who I didn't know, restored my humanity to me and lifted my spirits. And while I knew that I was facing death, and I knew with certainty that the worst thing they could do to me would be to kill me, until such time as they did that, I was my own person. Well, they could imprison me physically. They could not imprison my mind or my heart or my spirit. And so it was within those realms of myself that I determined I would live. Within that death cell, in that small space around myself, I had my own sanctuary. I learned to almost totally ignore what was around me. Sometime later, almost 6 months later, and 11 days before my execution date, my sentence was commuted from the death sentence to 40 years penal servitude without remission. And I was placed back out into the general prison population. This was done because an execution was not in the political interest of the government at that time. Now, I knew I couldn't possibly face 40 years there, and inspired by getting off death row, I determined to try to prove my innocence. I studied law in the prison, and I took my own case. With the help of a human rights lawyer named Greg O'Neill, we took the case to the Court of Criminal Appeal. While there were a number of grounds upon which my conviction could have been overturned, in May of 1995, my conviction was overturned because of conflicting testimony of police, and I was released from the Special Criminal Court. It was almost surreal. And when I stepped outside the court, I was faced with a huge crowd of media people with their cameras and their microphones. They were all shoving them in my face and throwing questions at me and wanting me to do things like give a clenched fist salute and all that nonsense. I didn't have a moment to myself. And then my lawyer took me and We went to the television station and we had an interview for the news. Afterwards, my friends had organized a party and everybody was drinking and happy and enjoying themselves and talking to me and clapping my back. But I wasn't really in it. I hadn't had time to assimilate my liberty. That night, I stayed with a friend in the suburbs of Dublin. The following morning, I woke up early and I went downstairs. The rest of the household was still asleep. And I went out to the backyard. They had a lovely backyard. It was stretched way back from the house. And I walked down the back garden, and the sun was shining, and I felt good. I began to breathe in the fresh air and the colors, the greenery, and hearing the birds singing. Down at the bottom of the garden, there was an old apple tree. I went up to this apple tree and I put my hand out and I touched the bark of the tree, which was gnarled. I was thinking about this tree, which had been growing there for countless years, season in, season out, every year producing its fruit, shedding its leaves, producing new leaves, and just carrying on its business in nature, oblivious of the big city around it, oblivious of the hatred and the anger and the injustice and the wars, the depredation and the hunger and everything that goes on, just simply being in nature. And I put my arms around that tree, and I wept. Powerful words, those. And now I'm going to read you one last story, which gave rise to the title of this book. Remember the title? All These Wonders? Well, let's find out the who, the wherefore, and the why for. Kathy Olkin wrote, on Approach to Pluto. It was the 4th of July this past summer, and I was really looking forward to a day off. Now, I had been working hard for a long time on NASA's New Horizons mission to Pluto, and there was always something to do. But I was going to take the 4th of July off. So I slept in. I read a little, decided to check my email. Never check email on a day off. There was a message there from the mission operations manager, Alice Bowman. My eye immediately went to it. It said that the spacecraft had gone safe. It called home, which is basically saying, help Me, I'm broken. That is the worst possible thing that can happen. I was like, how could this have happened? It was going to be a simple day, the day off. I had been working on this project for more than a decade. In 2004, I had relocated my family from California to Boulder, Colorado, to work on this mission. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm an astronomer, and I had been spending decades looking at Pluto through ground-based telescopes. And it's just this fuzzy dot. Well, there's not much to see. You can't make out any surface details. We kept looking through these ground-based telescopes, even through the Hubble Space Telescope. But it's still just a fuzzy dot, because Pluto is really far away. So we moved. My husband started commuting for his job, and we moved our 3-year-old and our 5-year-old. We were here, we were settled. All we needed to do now is build a spacecraft, test it, launch it, and fly it 3 billion miles to Pluto. So we did. Oh, it worked out. We built a small spacecraft about the size of a baby grand piano, and we launched it on the largest rocket we could get, an Atlas V. It's about 20 stories tall. So you've got a small spacecraft, a big rocket, and what you get is the fastest spacecraft ever launched. It's going at 34,000 miles per hour. Now, to put that in perspective, when the Apollo astronauts went to the moon, it took over 3 days. For New Horizons, the spacecraft passed the moon in just 9 hours. We were flying. It's an unmanned spacecraft, so I mean that figuratively. There was no one on it. But it will take the spacecraft 9.5 years to go from Earth to Pluto. So we've got a lot of time on our hands. We think about what data we're going to collect, how we're going to do it. And we make contingency plans in case something goes wrong. We consider more than 200 different scenarios. What do we do if this breaks? What do we do if it goes wrong? We had this huge binder full of contingencies. So I find myself on that 4th of July. It's just 10 days before our closest approach to Pluto. You see, we can't stop and orbit Pluto. We don't have enough fuel to slow ourselves down because we're going really fast. So we have to go right by and take the best images we can as we're flying past. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We have to get it right at this time. And the spacecraft has just gone safe. I rush over to the Mission Operations Center and I settle in the Situation Room. This is a conference room right outside the Mission Operations Center. You can see the operations people through the window, but they like to keep the scientists a little separated so we don't get in the way. I'm sitting with my colleagues, and interestingly, I'm starting to feel calm. You know, that sick feeling in the pit of my stomach is relaxing because I've been working with these people for more than a decade. Everyone knows what they need to do. We all know what our responsibilities are and how to make this work. We have 3 days to get the spacecraft back in working order. By July 7th, we have to have it up and ready to start executing these commands so that when it flies by Pluto, we get the data that we've been waiting more than a decade for. We start to get information back, but it takes a while. It takes the signal 4.5 hours to travel from Earth out to the spacecraft, and then it takes another 4.5 hours for it to come back so we can hear what the spacecraft had to say. So well, it's like a really slow conversation. Imagine you say hi to someone. Then you go watch 3 football games and you come back and they say hi back. That's the kind of data rates we're getting. We start to find out what went wrong. We had overtaxed the computer on the spacecraft. Remember, this computer is 10 years old. Now, my guess is that none of you use a computer that's 10 years old on a daily basis for really important things. But we planned for that. We sent 2 computers. So we overtaxed the prime computer, but before it crashed, it started the backup computer and said, "Call home." So now we're on the backup computer. We kind of know what went wrong, and we've got a big question in front of us. Do we try and get back on the prime computer, or do we fly through closest approach on our relatively untested backup computer? The whole time we've been flying across the solar system, we never turned on the backup computer. The last time it was on the ground when we were testing it a decade ago. So we make the logical decision to switch back over to the prime computer. But we're worried because if we really messed it up, it may not start. And we're getting short on time. At this point, we've been in the Situation Room for 3 days. People are taking naps in the conference room. Many orders of pizza are coming in and being eaten. We don't have a lot of time left. We send up the command to switch back over to the prime computer, and we sit and we wait. I find myself 9 hours later, back in the Situation Room, looking through the glass window at the operations people, hoping this works. When I hear mission operations manager, Alice Bowman's voice over the intercom say, "We are back on the prime computer." I see people erupting in cheers. Everybody is so elated. I let out this huge sigh of relief. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath. Oh, it was amazing. We managed to get the spacecraft back in working order. Everything was going right, and we had 4 hours to spare. It was outstanding. We started going back through our main sequence and getting data. It was absolutely stunning. Views of Pluto like we had never seen before. I couldn't believe the beauty and the details that were waiting for us at Pluto. We would have never expected the unusual terrain we've seen. We saw a heart-shaped glacier made out of nitrogen and carbon monoxide ices. At the edge of the glacier, there were huge mountains as tall as the Rocky Mountains, made out of water ice. Pluto has a large moon named Charon, and on that moon there's a deep canyon, deeper than the Grand Canyon. Oh, these wonders awaited us. When I had previously looked at Pluto through our ground-based telescopes, they were there. I just couldn't see them. We had accomplished our objectives of transforming Pluto from a fuzzy point of light to a complex, rich, geologic world. It was miraculous. Now, this story was told on September 21st, 2005 at Boulder Theater in Boulder, Colorado. The theme of the evening was high anxiety. Director, Mag Bowles. And now, I'm going to backtrack just a second, because did you notice all these wonders? That verbiage appears toward the end of the story, and I'll just reread a sentence or so before. Pluto has a large moon named Charon, and on that moon there's a deep canyon, deeper than the Grand Canyon. All these wonders awaited us. And now you have a hint of the wonders that await you. And as a treat, since I did the first book of Moth stories, and now I've done this book of Moth stories, next Friday, I'll read you a story or two from the other Moth compendium of delight that awaits you at Story and Song. I'll see you on Wednesday for some poetry. Thank you for coming, and have a wonderful, wonderful, full of wonder weekend. Bye-bye.